In the summer of 1889, when Newport sea breeze carried the scent of salted decay and wealth danced behind lace curtains, the name Genevieve Harrow vanished from whispered society columns as swiftly as it had once ignited them. A woman of impossible beauty and cruel charm, she had hosted opium-laced masquerades beneath chandeliers imported from Florence, flaunted her forbidden liaisons with European aristocrats, and publicly defied the iron etiquette of America's old money elite, until, one moonless evening, after a scandalous incident at the cliff walk where her blood-stained parasol was found beside the trembling body of a servant boy who had clawed at his own eyes, she simply disappeared. No witnesses, no carriage tracks, no ransom note, only a faint trail of crimson leading toward the sea, and a final, eerie message scrawled in salt across her boudoir mirror. "Don't try to follow me, they already know." Whispers grew like mold in the velvet-lined drawing rooms of Newport, where the elite gathered in their corseted gossip to speculate on Genevieve Harrow's fate, though none dared speak too loudly near the oil portrait of her that still hung, eyes too lifelike, mouth too close to smiling, in the library of the Harrow estate. Her father, Commodore Ambrose Harrow, once a lion of the Navy and now a silent wreck of a man, claimed she had eloped to Vienna with a baron, but those closest to the family knew he hadn't spoken a word since the night she vanished, only staring blankly out the conservatory windows, muttering phrases in Latin no one could translate. The household staff began quitting en masse, citing strange occurrences, the smell of burnt hair in the guest rooms, boots filled with seawater by morning, a woman's laughter echoing from the walls when no one was there, and then came the letters, unsigned, scrawled in ash-like ink, delivered to the door of every guest who had attended her final soiree, each one reading simply, "She brought them back with her. You should not have watched." The police had long abandoned the investigation, quietly discouraged by unseen hands from the highest social echelons, but a few curious minds remained unsettled, particularly Elias Moore, a young archivist with a fascination for Newport's hidden scandals, who began poring over the Harrow family's private correspondences stored in the Historical Society's vault, discovering references to something Genevieve had allegedly brought home from her grand tour of the Carpathians, a mirror of morning, sent to her from a crypt monastery in Romania, said to reflect not your face but the thing watching you through it. The deeper Elias dug, the more disturbing his discoveries became. Visitors to the Harrow estate in the months before Genevieve's disappearance had complained of chills, of dreams bleeding into waking hours, of waking up with scratches they couldn't explain. In a forgotten diary entry, Genevieve wrote of the sisters beneath the floorboards, and of a figure in black lace that stood by her bed at 3:13 a.m. every night, whispering promises in dead tongues. Elias's hands shook as he read on, realizing this wasn't a woman who vanished. This was a woman who had been erased, peeled out of existence like spoiled fruit from the core of a rotting apple. Elias, consumed by the mystery, visited the long-abandoned Harrow estate, now a crumbling relic shrouded in ivy and silence, where rumor claimed the staff refused to speak her name and where locals whispered of candlelight flickering in the broken windows on moonless nights. He slipped inside one autumn evening, recorder in hand, and found that the air was unnaturally still, too still, like the world had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe. In the drawing room, he discovered Genevieve's music box still wound, playing a warped lullaby as if waiting all these decades for someone to listen. Beneath a loose floorboard, Elias found a velvet pouch containing the mirror, tarnished, cracked, but intact. And against every instinct, he looked into it. The reflection showed not himself, but Genevieve, pale and expressionless, standing in the burned-out conservatory behind him, lips moving silently as blood tears slid down her cheeks. Elias spun around, heart in his throat. The room was empty, yet the air now thrummed with the same whisper noted in her diary, not in any known language but still perfectly understood. "You saw me. Now you're mine." Elias fled the estate, the mirror wrapped in cloth and shoved deep into his satchel, but something had changed in him. His reflection no longer moved in perfect sync. It delayed, it stared, it smiled when he didn't, and at night, he began waking to the sound of piano keys playing that same distorted lullaby from the Harrow drawing room, even though there was no piano in his apartment. Neighbors complained of flickering lights and the scent of roses mixed with decay seeping through the walls. And Elias's voice began to shift, deeper, raspier, more like the one he'd recorded whispering Genevieve's name from behind the mirror. Desperate for answers, he visited the Newport Historical Society, where an archivist named Miriam unearthed a sealed ledger titled The Unspoken Debutantes, listing women who'd vanished without record during the late 1800s, all connected to one name scribbled in the margins, G.H. As Miriam traced her finger across the ink, her eyes rolled back, and she whispered in the same guttural tone Elias had begun to recognize as his own in dreams, "The mirror remembers. The mirror returns." Elias realized Genevieve hadn't vanished, she had been trapped, and now she wasn't alone anymore. Elias couldn't shake the suffocating dread that followed him after the encounter at the Historical Society. His dreams grew violent, soaked in the scent of wilted lilies and shadowy corridors lined with mirrors that reflected not just his face but moments he never lived. A man in a tuxedo bleeding from the mouth, a masked crowd chanting his name at a firelit masquerade, and Genevieve, standing perfectly still in the center, eyes hollow, hands cupped around a single black rose. Miriam disappeared that night, her apartment ransacked and her research burned except for one note pinned to her door. "Reflection is infection." Elias retreated to his childhood home in Providence, hoping distance might weaken the presence, but the moment he unpacked the mirror from its cloth, foolishly unwilling to destroy it, the lights flickered, a swarm of moths smashed against the window, and his phone lit up with a voicemail from an unknown number, the recording an old phonograph hiss. "You see her now, don't you?" Elias, panicked, contacted a reclusive folklore professor, Dr. Corbin Wolfe, who agreed to meet him only in broad daylight and demanded Elias bring the mirror sealed in a coffin of salt and silver. Corbin, pale and trembling, examined it without touching and whispered, "This isn't a cursed object, it's a sealed one. Someone locked something inside, and now it's leaking." Corbin Wolfe's revelation echoed like thunder in Elias's mind, sealed, not cursed, suggesting that Genevieve's mirror wasn't merely haunted but a deliberate prison for something older, darker, something that now stirred after decades of silence. Corbin traced its origin not to Genevieve herself, but to an obscure 17th-century cult operating in Rhode Island, the Order of the Hollow Reflection, a group that believed mirrors weren't tools of vanity, but doorways to reverse selves, entities that fed on guilt, shame, and memory. Elias learned that Genevieve's family had long been linked to the order, her great-grandmother being one of the last known high priestesses before the group was purged during a fire that razed an entire parish in 1813. The mirror, passed down through bloodlines, was a vessel of containment, and Genevieve, knowingly or not, had broken the containment when she died, and her secrets were auctioned off. Corbin urged Elias to return the mirror to the coastal ruins of the old Newport chapel where the order had last convened, a place now buried under ivy and nearly erased from city records, and there perform a ritual from Genevieve's recovered diary, a diary Miriam had digitized days before her disappearance and uploaded to a hidden cloud folder that Elias found labeled simply, "In case I don't come back." The ritual required Elias to look into the mirror under moonlight and ask it not what he wanted, but who was watching him through it. The path to the ruins was overgrown, guarded by gnarled trees and silence so heavy it muffled even Elias's breath as he carried the mirror wrapped in canvas, each step echoing with ancestral dread. The old chapel stood like a skeleton of its former sanctity, shattered stained glass and stone walls devoured by moss. But when Elias placed the mirror upon the altar where the Order of the Hollow Reflection once gathered, the wind died as if the forest itself were holding its breath. As moonlight filtered through the collapsed roof, it struck the mirror's surface, not reflecting Elias's face, but a flickering gallery of unfamiliar eyes, dozens of them, as though someone, something, was behind the glass watching him with ancient hunger. Elias, heart racing, whispered the invocation written in Genevieve's spidery script, "I return you to silence, to the hollow, to the lie behind the light," and with each word, the mirror shivered, sounds bleeding through it, whispers in Latin, in sobs, in voices Elias recognized from dreams. Then came the final question, the one that Miriam had warned him never to ask unless he was ready to hear the answer. "Who watches me through this mirror?" And with that, the mirror turned black, darker than night, revealing not a face, but the interior of a room that wasn't Elias's, with someone standing in front of a mirror, him, but aged, broken, a version that had never stopped searching. Elias stepped back, but his reflection did not. It stared at him and mouthed, "I am who you become if you don't let go." Elias staggered backward, his breath stolen by the impossible image, his reflection, older and haunted, trapped in a world where the past was never buried, where the mirror had fed on his soul for decades. The chapel around him groaned as if alive, as if the mirror's awakening had reanimated the bones of every secret ever whispered inside its walls. The air thickened, dense with memories not his own. He saw flashes of a masquerade in 1889, a woman in crimson silk spinning beneath chandeliers before vanishing mid-twirl, guests frozen in horror, and Genevieve, young and terrified, standing before a mirror just like this one, screaming as her face dissolved into 1,000 versions of herself. Elias's knees buckled, the visions blinding, overwhelming, but then, silence. The mirror dimmed, the chapel still. And at its base, etched into the marble beneath years of moss, he found a name not recorded in any registry, not mentioned in any article: Vivian Leclerc. The missing socialite. The name echoed through him like a ghost's breath. And suddenly, the whispers in the mirror made sense. They weren't speaking to him, they were warning him. Vivian hadn't disappeared into the night, she had been absorbed, consumed by the reflection, trapped in a timeless prison of memory and shame. Elias, trembling, now understood that the mirror didn't just reflect truth, it devoured it. It showed you your deepest obsession, then fed on your need to know, to understand, until all that remained was a version of you with no self, just questions. And now, the mirror wanted Elias too. But he wasn't like the others. He had one thing they didn't: closure. Elias stood at the edge of the altar, the cold stone beneath his fingers anchoring him to reality as the mirror's surface rippled like disturbed water, begging him to step through. But instead of surrendering, he reached into his coat and retrieved the only item he'd brought from Newport's archives, a faded brooch, long thought lost, bearing the Leclerc crest. Genevieve's. Vivian's. It glowed faintly in his palm, almost pulsing with memory. As he held it up to the glass, the mirror hissed like boiling blood, recoiling from the emblem as if scorched. A scream, long, guttural, female, ripped through the chapel, and Elias saw her. Vivian. Her face twisted in anguish, pressed against the inner side of the glass, not aged, not young, but broken. "Tell them the truth," she mouthed. "They buried me alive in memory. Burn the lies." The mirror cracked down the center like thunder splitting the sky. The walls trembled. Dust fell from the rafters. Elias staggered but did not look away. He stepped forward, pressed the brooch to the fracture, and whispered, "You are remembered." A white light surged from the mirror, engulfing the chapel, and for a moment, everything was silence. When Elias opened his eyes, the mirror was gone. Not shattered. Not broken. Simply, absent. In its place, only the faint outline of a doorway that had once been. The chapel was still again. The curse, the reflection, the hunger, it had ended. Or so he thought. Because as Elias turned to leave, the stained glass above the altar shimmered. His reflection stared down at him. But it blinked a beat too late. Smiled a fraction too wide. And vanished. Elias didn't speak of the reflection again, not to his colleagues, not in his field notes, not even in his dreams. But something had shifted. In Newport, the air felt different, as if the town itself had exhaled after holding its breath for more than a century. The abandoned chapel was sealed off, condemned within a week. No one objected. No one even remembered requesting it. Tourists stopped visiting the hill. Locals avoided the area without knowing why. But Elias knew. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the shadows stretched too far across his walls, he would sometimes see movement in glass, mirrors, windows, the sheen of water on his bathroom floor. A flicker of a woman in black. A whisper that never quite formed words. The Leclerc family, once a symbol of grandeur and prestige, had been reduced to a single tale Elias published under a pseudonym, The Hollow Heir. It made minor waves in occult circles, but mainstream historians dismissed it as folklore. Still, those who dared read it often reported strange dreams afterward. One reader from Boston described waking up with bloody fingernail marks on her mirror. Another, from Charleston, swore she saw a woman weeping behind her bedroom glass, wearing 1880s silk. Elias began receiving letters, all handwritten, no return addresses, all sealed with red wax. They carried no messages, only pressed flowers, faded photographs, and sometimes, lockets with initials scratched out. He burned each one without opening. The last letter arrived on a winter morning. Inside was a folded newspaper clipping, missing socialite declared dead after 130 years. Below it, a single line scribbled in crimson ink, "You cannot erase what still watches." Elias closed his eyes. Somewhere behind him, a mirror creaked that in the final days of that cursed winter, Elias packed up his notes, photographs, and the only surviving artifacts from the LeClaire case, an ornate hairpin, a withered journal, and the tarnished locket that still hummed faintly when held too long. He left Newport quietly, under a gray sky veined with frost, never to return. But stories have a way of traveling, especially those soaked in old blood and whispered prayers. Years later, at a university lecture in Prague, Elias, now older, hollow-eyed, and prematurely gray, was asked about the infamous Newport case. He smiled politely and said, "Some stories demand to be forgotten." But his hands trembled. What he didn't say was that every mirror in his home was now covered with velvet cloth, that he hadn't seen his own reflection in over a decade. He didn't mention the visitor who came every year on the same night, November 14th, the date Marie Leclaire disappeared. A woman with wet hair and hollow eyes would stand silently at his door, never knocking, never speaking, just waiting. One year, he looked out too long. He was found hours later, collapsed, mumbling in French, a language he didn't speak. Authorities said it was a stroke. But a nurse reported something strange. Elias kept repeating the phrase, "Elle n'a jamais quitté la chapelle." She never left the chapel. After his death, his home was emptied, his files archived, and mysteriously, many went missing. The locket, the journal, the mirror from his study, gone. Some believe they were stolen. Others think they returned to where they belonged. Now, in Newport, the old chapel ruins are off-limits, surrounded by rusting iron gates. Locals say a woman walks the grounds during foggy evenings, singing in a broken, choking voice. Her reflection has been spotted in puddles, in windows, in car mirrors, but never facing the same direction twice. Those who stare too long say they hear a name whispered behind their ear, Marie. And so ends the tale of the disgraced socialite who disappeared, yet never truly left. The town of Newport has learned to live with its silence. But you, now that you've heard the story, should be careful around mirrors. Because some stories, once learned, do not let go. And some eyes, once they've seen yours, will always find you again.